Welcome back to the About Manchester podcast. This week we speak to Jack Cooke, author of the book The End of the Road, A Journey Around Britain in Search of the Dead. Jack embarked on a journey around Britain in search of famous tombs and forgotten burials. We speak to him today about his journey.
This is the most remarkable book, Jack, and maybe one of the most remarkable things is that you travelled over 2,000 miles across the UK in a hearse. And as much as the stories in the book are captivating, I have to say that for me, I almost enjoyed your travels in the hearse as much as including your travelling companion Enfield the Spider. What made you decide to travel in a hearse?
So I set out when I'd made up my mind to sort of go looking for all these unusual grave sites and memorials. I was trying to think of what I was going to travel around the country in, and it just it struck me that a hearse was a kind of perfect time machine. It's the particular one that I ended up buying in the classifieds off an undertaker in Bristol. It was built in 1972, so it'd been burying people for. I think it retired in 2008, so been burying people for a long time all around the country. Probably averaging about 3 or 4 funerals a week. So it sort of appealed to me as a way of throwing myself in at the deep end, and it seemed like the perfect vehicle to chase all these ghosts, all these stories of the departed.
Mm-hmm. You had some interesting encounters in it. I think at one point somebody thought you were a taxi.
Yeah, I drove past a pub in South London, and there was a bunch of guys sitting on a picnic table in front, and one of them ran out into the road, sort of pint in hand, and tried to flag me down. But he sort of did a double take when he got a bit closer. And then backed off with his eyes on the road, looking a bit shamefaced. So that was quite funny.
Well, what sort of other reaction did you get when you turned up in some of these places in a black hearse?
A bit of a mix of things. Quite a few people, not surprisingly, quite horrified by the associations with the hearse. They find it a pretty grim reminder, so they sort of back off. A couple of times I parked in places to spend the night, and there was one time up in Scotland I parked in a lay-by, and it was next to a couple of motorhomes, people who were camping, and when I woke up in the morning they both disappeared. So they obviously didn't like the idea of spending the night next to a hearse, but a mixed thing. Some people of course were fascinated because it was an old car and it was rumbling on, and it was basically on the verge of being scrapped, so they were sort of amazed that it was still on the road, really.
And it also served as a bed.
Yes. So on the journey around the UK, I did a mixture of some of the grave sites that I visited were pretty far from any roads, so I tended to camp and sort of little pilgrimages to sort of make my way out there. Sometimes I stopped in the odd travel lodge for a shower and a shave. But yeah, I did sleep in the hearse several nights on the coffin deck, and it was a pretty, to begin with, I was terrified of the idea of sleeping in the back, and in some ways it seemed disrespectful. And I kind of, the first night that I slept in it, I actually had a really sort of vain, egotistical dream about my own funeral, and imagining sort of, which is appropriate for sleeping. Imagine my whole family sort of coming out to say goodbye, and I sort of woke up just feeling so ashamed of of this thought. But I got used to it, and in the end, it just felt like by the end, of the journey, as you say, it was almost 2,000 miles. It just felt like I had this whole collection of characters that had joined me in the hearse, and it wasn't quite such a spooky, empty vehicle anymore.
Mm-hmm. So turning to the subject, Jack, what was the motivation behind the trip and the idea for the book? In fact, did the trip come before the book, or were they both together? Was the idea always to write a book?
So the idea came, I suppose, originally. I grew up in Suffolk, next to a really small little parish churchyard, a tiny little church. And for years, I sort of walked past this churchyard, and I thought, well, I counted the gravestones and thought, well, there's a few hundred people buried there. And then I was listening to actually a podcast years ago with Bill Bryson on it, and he used to live up in Norfolk, and he went round a similar tiny church with a friend of his who was an archaeologist, and the friend said, "So, Bill, how many people do you think are buried here?" And he sort of ummed and ahed, and he said, "Oh, same thought that I had." He said, "Oh, a few hundred," and the friend looked at him and said, "No, it's more like 10,000, which is just the sheer, even a small village, just over the centuries, the community, the number of people going into the ground is extraordinary." So I suddenly realized that I'd grown up in the middle of nowhere, but surrounded, by thousands of people in the ground, all of whom were strangers, and none of, I didn't know any of their stories. So I got quite curious to uncover a bit more. So I started visiting some local churchyards, and then I realized that a lot of people historically weren't necessarily buried in churchyards or cemeteries at all. They actually, a lot of unconsecrated burials in this island. There's people that are buried on mountains and beaches and all kinds of places. So that was kind of the thread that got me excited about the idea of setting out and discovering or rediscovering some of these places. I think it was also, I'm 30, coming on 36 now. I was 33 when I set out in the hearse, and I'm pretty lucky. I had a second child had just been born. I had pretty good health, and I just never really thought about death. Unless a relative died or a friend, I kind of ignored it. So I sort of, part of the inspiration for the book was this idea of fronting up to the fate that we all share, and trying to sort of make peace with it by going and visiting some of these places. So yeah, those were the sort of two inspirations for it.
Did writing, researching, and traveling did it bring you closer to your own mortality, and did it make you think differently?
It did, yeah. I think in a strange way, I found it quite comforting to stand beside all these, the mortal remains of all these people. I think mostly because all the graves I visited, whether it was on an industrial estate or in the middle of a really scenic national park, they all kind of have a place in the landscape. And I felt really comforted by this idea that we're all attached to the places, whether it's Manchester or Suffolk, we're all attached to the places that we're raised in and we die. And they've all got a, unique atmosphere as well, depending where in the country it is. So visiting all those places, sort of, it was, by the end of the journey, I did feel comforted and reconciled to the inevitable.
I thought one of the things that struck me, Jack, was certainly some of the stories showed this thing of people sort of almost in a battle for immortality, or the people were trying to make sure they were remembered for future generations. And I suppose some people trying to cheat death, or at least trying to cheat the afterlife and prepare for the afterlife. Was that the case? Do you agree with that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, one of the funny things that came out of the journey was just the fact that human memory is really short-lived, and the impermanence of everything. Whether I visited some really monumental graves, I visited a temple made of sandstone in the Hebrides, and some really, as you say, people that wanted to project a lasting memory of themselves. And at the same time, I went to a crematorium where people leased a little memorial on a wall for just 10 years, and then that's it, and they were gone. But the funny thing is, of course, like even the temples and the granite, the obelisks and all of it, they all eventually decay, fall over. People forget the associations. People redevelop the land. Mass graves are buried under golf links. All kinds of. It's just the nature of living on a very small and crowded island. So again, I think by the end, I found that quite a comforting thought that really we're all just absorbed back into the landscape. Really, we just don't have a claim. Even, I mean, the stories where people tried to, make these elaborate wills to ensure that future generations would look after them, they always after a time, it fall foul of some change, or someone repossessing the land that they're buried in, or where their ashes were scattered. So it's it's a lot of history.
Okay. In my opinion, the book does contain many heroes. Most of them probably unsung, and most of them never heard of by the majority of people. There were so many to choose from in the book, but just tell me a few of your favourites.
I think some of my favourites were the graves that required a bit of a physical effort to get there. You know, quite isolated spots. There's a loch up in the Northwest Highlands called Loch Marie, and it's got about 60 little islands floating in the middle of this loch. And boats, or at least motorized boats, are banned from actually going on the loch. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. But there's a tiny island graveyard in the middle that's actually had burials there for over a millennium. And it's I had to, in the end, I had to swim out there. It was summertime, but it was still pretty freezing cold. But I ended up I'm not a very strong swimmer, but I ended up having to sort of island hop to get out to this mystical place. And the graveyard itself was a really strange mix of kind of modern burials and ancient burials. So that was totally fascinating, and and felt like a place apart. I think I enjoyed some of the more sort of eccentric graves. There's a grave in southwest London in Mortlake, famous Victorian explorer called Sir Richard Burton. His wife had him buried in a stone tent. So they used to travel a lot in the Middle East and elsewhere in canvas tents, and she made a mausoleum out of stone, and lots of people will know this story, but they're buried alongside each other in there, and you can kind of look in on their coffins side by side. And I ended up camping next to them in that graveyard for the night.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
There were so many, really, and I also, I visited a couple of relatives and some I tried to cover as much of a sort of time period, and as you say, also celebrate some of the unsung men and women as well as the more famous ones.
One of the stories that's sort of close to us here in Manchester, and I'd never heard this story before, was the Neil Moss, the caver who died in the High Peak caverns. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, that's probably one of the more recent burial sites. In living memory, there's plenty of people alive who were involved with the story. So Neil Moss was a young university student who came up to the Derbyshire Dales and was very keen on caving, and he went down Peak Cavern, which is, as you well know, is a famous cave. And that was in 1959, and he went down with a small team of geologists and cavers, and they went all the way down into a cavern that was over a sort of mile under the ground, and they had to worm their way through a feature in the rock called the eye hole, which is like a tiny muddy fissure in the rock, and they had to sort of squeeze themselves through by their shoulders. It's still a very popular route today with cavers, but they ended up in this amazing cavern full of different rock formations, and in a corner was a hole in a slope in this cavern. There was a hole in the floor, probably only a sort of couple of feet wide, that disappeared downwards. And like all cavers, they had this kind of insatiable desire to explore what no one had before and see if they could link up different caves within the amazing system under the Derbyshire Dales. And Neil Moss, although he was quite a tall man, over 6 foot, he volunteered to be the first one to go down this tube. And he went down, I can't remember exactly how far, I think about 15, 20 feet. And then the tube suddenly kinked and kind of twisted back on itself like an elbow in this passageway. And he wormed his way around the corner and eventually came down to basically a choke of rocks in the bottom of the tube that he couldn't get any further down. So he signaled to his team that he was coming back up again. But almost immediately that he tried, they actually dropped a rope down, a little rope for him to assist him. Almost as soon as he pulled on it, he wedged his shoulders inside this cavity. And what happened from that point was an enormous and much publicized in the national and local press, this enormous effort to rescue this young man. Teams of specialist cavers, doctors, all kinds of rescue attempts were made, and Peak Cavern became this hive of activity with hundreds of people outside and relays of people carrying. One of the problems for Neil Moss was he was quickly running out of oxygen because his own recycled breath in this tube that he climbed into was starting to suffocate him. And he was also using, which they were used for years, carbide lamps. Cavers and miners, used these, and the fumes from that, when it had also settled in the tube with him. So he was in a terrible position, and the rescue attempt went on for, I think, several days before his breathing finally gave out and it was abandoned. And his father made a very specific request. The Peak Cavern was about to flood. They were expecting very heavy rain. He made a request that no one tried to retrieve his son's body. And they all evacuated the cave, but then some cavers went back the next weekend and they actually filled in this tube with some boulders and carved Neil's name into the rock beside the hole where he climbed down. So kind of permanent, this extraordinary grave, half a mile or more underground. And I mean, I think I visited Peak Cavern and I didn't go beyond, your usual day trippers don't go very far. But as far as I went, I kind of thought, I think to a lot of people, the idea of being buried in the bottom of an underground cave system is horrifying. But I suppose, as terrible as his death was, it was something that he was passionate about. And actually, in some ways, it's quite an appropriate memorial. And as I say, if you're a very keen caver and you go on an expedition down there, you can still see his memorial today.
Right. Okay. The other thing I found fascinating in this part of the country was the fact that so many people were having their ashes scattered in the Lake District, aka Alfred Wainwright. That there's been an environmental impact.
Yeah. So I read an article by some local ecologists who said in some of the fells close to where Alfred Wainwright was scattered on haystacks, apparently on some of the more exposed summits of these Lakeland mountains, because of the exposure, some quite rare grasses and different wild plants grow because there's not much competition when it's that poor quality soil. But apparently the practice of scattering ashes, which remains quite popular, has actually fertilized the soil so that some of these rare plant species are being outcompeted by more common lowland, grasses and plants that are now colonizing those areas. So kind of fascinating consequence of scattering ashes.
You saw visions of loads of people, obviously not at the moment in lockdown, but of loads of people up there scattering their relatives' ashes all over the place.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't blame anyone for wanting to do it. It's such a, obviously a romantic place, and it has associations for a lot of people. And it's an amazing place if you were trying to say goodbye to someone. But clearly it's got problems, and I think that there's also been reports of very unfortunate instances of people, climbing up a mountain and getting a face full of ash coming down the other way.
Oh, wonderful! That sounds wonderful. Did you spend? How long did it take you to do this journey?
That was nearly a month.
Oh, okay. I suppose has lockdown been difficult for you after doing that?
I did in 2018, and I'm really doing penance because I abandoned my very young children and my wife to go off in this hearse for a month. So I think I've been making up for it ever since. So lockdown's probably been a good thing in that sense. But no, it was an amazing escape to have the freedom to go and travel around the country and visit all these special places.
Okay. Have you plans for any more projects?
Yeah, a few projects in the running at the moment. Nothing definite. One thing that that this project, sort of really brought to the forefront was I think personally, my own sort of belief system, which was reinforced by this, is I do very much kind of believe that we sort of go back into the ground that we're buried in or scattered on. We're reconstituted, we break down, we become things around us, and I'm quite interested in that notion of people in the landscape, and I'm also a very keen stargazer, something I do quite a lot out here in Suffolk. So I'm thinking of sort of maybe a more philosophical book to come, possibly. About something along those lines that combines those sort of trains of thought. But yeah, I won't be getting back in a hearse anytime soon.
And have you decided how you want to be remembered when you pass off this mortal coil?
Yeah, I love that expression. I think I'd like to be buried in the back garden, really, but I think and massively, devalue the place that you're buried. Finally putting the compost. I've gone off cremation a little bit. I visited a crematorium and saw a cremulator in action, which is the machine that grinds human bone to dust, and it's an ash. And I have to say, it's not. I think in an ideal world, if I didn't have an ego and I wasn't vain, I'd let my relatives decide. Let it be for the people that come after you, just sort of as a comfort to them. But if I had my way and I wrote a new will tomorrow, I think I'd say, yeah, put me in the compost heap or something.
Okay, that was interesting. You talk because one of the things you do talk about in the book is the rise of the crematorium, isn't it? I didn't realise that this practice only started at the turn of the 20th century, wasn't it? Really?
Yeah, and it was so sort of unfashionable and kind of frowned upon in the beginning, and people were slow to adopt it. That some of the first people to be cremated at the tail end of the 19th century actually insisted on, as opposed to going into urns, which we know today, and sort of receptacles for ash, they actually had tombstones, full-on gravestones carved and then placed on top of a kind of void with the ashes behind. So they couldn't quite let go of the idea of gravestones. Some of the first people who were being cremated, and it took right into the 20th century before it became common enough practice for people to give up on that.
The two final journeys I want to take you on in the book, which were some of the most fascinating for me. The first was Dunnage, which I imagine is just up the road. It's not far from where you are at the moment.
Yeah, it's just up the coast from where I grew up here in Suffolk, and it's a famous for having fallen into the sea. So the whole east coast of England, as you all know, is slowly being eroded, or quite rapidly being eroded in the case of some winter storms. And Dunnage was a huge medieval port, to rival some of the sort of ports that the big modern ports in Britain today. And at one time it had I think eight churches, and it was a really thriving merchant town. And then a succession of storms essentially washed away much of the town, and one by one the churches fell into the sea. And one of the last churches to fall into the sea, the graveyard, or the remnants of the graveyard, in fact, just one remaining headstone, is right on the cliff edge, about to topple into the North Sea. And for years, the bones of people buried in this churchyard have been popping out the cliff onto the beach. It's a fairly morbid place, but with amazing history, and a lot of even though it's the North Sea and you can't see your hand in front of your face if you go diving, divers have gone down into the medieval ruins half a mile offshore now, some of them, and explored some of the remnants of stonework that are lying under the sea. It was a good place to start, because this idea of it never lasts. As we said at the beginning, any kind of memorial tends to dissolve. So I like it's a good place to reflect on that.
And finally, to one of my most popular places, Hoy and the Lady of Hoy.
The Lady of Hoy, yes. So, you've been there, Nigel. So you know what
I have, yeah.
Beautiful place it is. But just to summarise her story quickly, so the Lady of Hoy, as she came to be known, was a woman called Betty Corrigal, and she lived on the Isle of Hoy in Orkney, in the 1770s. In a sort of tragic story, she met a sailor who was in port and conceived a child with him, and then he fled, ran away to sea, and left her on her own. And her very small island community shunned her, basically on because she wasn't married and she was with child. So she took her own life and hung herself. And she was buried, because suicide was frowned upon in the 18th century. She was actually buried in the middle of the Isle of Hoy, miles from any of the communities there, on the kind of parish boundaries, in a very bleak but very beautiful moor. And she stayed there for a long time. But then in 1933, some men were cutting peat, which was commonly used for fires, in a peat bank under the moor where she was buried, and they exposed a corner of her coffin. So the men were terrified. They got hold of the island postmaster, who came out, and they opened the coffin, and Betty Corrigal was almost perfectly preserved, according to accounts from that time, because she'd been buried in the peat, which is starved of oxygen and very acidic. It had essentially mummified her body, and this is something that's found right across Europe in areas where there are peat bogs. And there's some famous examples of much older bodies, thousands of years old, that have come out almost perfectly preserved. And she was reportedly very, very beautiful as well, with long hair around her shoulders and eyelashes and eyebrows, all completely intact. So there was, for a time, the postmaster was concerned that this was a recent burial, perhaps foul play had been involved. But then eventually that they discovered that this body had actually been there since the 1770s, and they reburied her. Unfortunately, in the Second World War, when Orkney became the centre for the British Navy and Scapa Flow, and very important tactically, there were hundreds of soldiers posted in barracks on Hoy and around Hoy, and one of them, they actually returned to the same peat bank and amazingly managed to dig up the coffin for a second time. And unfortunately, she became a sort of a bit of a running joke amongst the soldiers, and they would continue to dig her up, show her to their friends, play practical jokes, to the point where her body was obviously deteriorating very fast now, having been exposed. And then one of the commanding officers of one of these barracks finally put an end to it by reburying her on the moor, but by putting a concrete slab over her coffin.
That's right, yeah.
But at this point, she still had no fixed marker or headstone or anything to say, you know, again, as a suicide, she hadn't had any permanent memorial. And an American minister came over after the war and was so taken with the story that he actually held a funeral service in the 1950s for this woman that had died in the 1770s. And he put in a big wooden cross above the grave. But because it's a peat bog, of course, the wooden cross very quickly got sucked in, rotted, fell over. But again, they had this issue of how to sort of permanently mark the site. And then a local carpenter who'd lived on Hoy all his life, he fashioned a headstone from fiberglass and installed that in the 1970s with a second funeral service. So Betty ended up having 2 funeral services in the space of 30 years. And if you visit this grave today, which I'd recommend to anyone that ends up on Orkney, it's quite a hike, because I said she's buried in the middle of nowhere. But the gravestone, it looks, because it's weathered since the 1970s, it looks you'd be forgiven for thinking it was solid stone. But then, of course, if you tap it, it just rings completely hollow, like, you know, something from a sort of Disneyland. So yeah, a very atmospheric place and an amazing story. And actually, I finished the whole journey, the whole tomb tour. I finished on Hoy.
You did, yes, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jack. It's been lovely talking to you. Very, very interesting, and I'd recommend anyone to go and buy the book. Do you want to give the book a big a little plug, Jack?
Of course I do. Thanks, Nigel. The book's called The End of the Road, A Journey Around Britain in Search of the Dead. And it's very sad that all the bookshops are closed, but you can check your local bookshops, see if they're doing deliveries, or you can get it online as well. But thanks for having me on the podcast, Nigel.
No, that's lovely. And